Welcome to module number 4, implementing species distribution models in Google Earth Engine. Understanding where species occur in space and time has been always a fundamental question in ecology, and several models have been developed through the years to try to answer this question. And this question has motivated one type of models are known as species distribution models or ecological niche models or habitat suitability models. These are empirical models that link species locations with predictor variables so we can access patterns of species occurrence and habitat suitability. The theory behind these models is that if we have a set of occurrence data, so locations in space where we know our species of interest exists, and we can link that to environmental variables, then we can use algorithms to try to model to fit the niche. So what are the conditions in which these species can maintain a population? And then once we have our model fit, we can then use it to predict across the broader landscape where these animal or plant or species of interest are the suitable habitat or also the potential distribution. I'm not going to go much in the details or the theory behind species distribution models in this lecture, but if you want to learn more about the theory, we recommend you the book Habitat Suitability and Distribution Models with Applications in R by Gisan, Twiller, and Zimmerman. These models have become recently critical components of the studies in the field of ecology, evolutionary biology, wildlife management, and conservation, and are nowadays one of the most widely used modeling tools for analyzing occurrence data and predicting habitat suitability in time and space. Currently, there are many different algorithms that can use to feed the species distribution models, among them generalized linear models, generalized additive models, random forest, gradient boosting, maximum entropy, etc. So a lot of progress has been made in terms of modeling, algorithms, and software. There's multiple software to feed SDMs, and probably R is one of the most common programming languages used among ecologists. Then, in parallel to this, and the improvement of computers, of course, is all the advance in remote sensing products that now are also freely accessible. And so we have seen in previous management data model for Earth Engine that we have so much spatial data available that we can use as predictor variables. But we also saw in the previous model that there are many classifiers that are the same classifiers used in SDMs when we try to use land cover change or land cover classifications. We use the same algorithms to feed species distribution models. So then Google Earth Engine provides us all the elements that we need to feed a species distribution model: petabyte catalog of available spatial imagery and classifiers that we can combine to predict species distribution models. So the idea now is we will start with a really basic and simple SDM, and then we can build more complex workflows that incorporate all the best practices at the time of fitting models. Let's move into Google Earth Engine now and try to put a very basic species distribution model. Here we will create some present absence data, combine that with predictor variables that we have access in Earth Engine, and then feed the classifier and generate our first very simple species distribution model from which we can build on. The idea is that we can start understanding the basic steps. So the first thing we need is the presence and absence data. So we're going to focus in South America, and we will use a hypothetical species. Let's say we have a species that likes mountains, high Andean areas. So we first need feature collection for presence, and we create a property press apps with values of 1. So these are our presence data. So we want to create presence data along the Andes, high elevated areas, arid environments. We generate around 20 points. Next, we want to generate absences. Again, this is a feature collection with the same property, press absence, but with values 0. And then we have another 20 points for absences. Finally, I want to have a new layer that's going to be a square to define our area of interest. And that can be just a geometry. So we want to map this. This is going to be our South American continent, more or less. So now we have presence, absence, and our area of interest. I'm going to click that. So note that I'm using this / with the asterisk to comment out the code so we can walk through and understand what we are doing. So the first thing we want to do is combine the presence and the absence. We call this absence. So if it's violet, that means we are reading the variable we have here. So we use the function merge to combine the present and the absence. And we look at the points. We have 40 points now. So the first one, we can look at the property is a 1. And then in the bottom, we have the absences with a 0. So this is our presence absence dataset. Next, we want to bring some predictor variables. In this case, we're going to use an elevation layer we have used before. And then we're going to bring the WorldClim dataset that we can take a look at. These are 19 climatic variables. We have things like annual mean temperature, temperature of the seasonality, the maximum temperature of warmest month, and so on, and the similar for precipitation. These are highly used in SDMs. And so we're going to bring these 19 variables from this image, and next we combine them. The elevation, we add the bands from the bioclimatic variables, and then we clip it to our area of interest. So when I print this, we should have 20 bands in one image. Both are images. And then we're going to display that in the one of those bands, like this is the bio 1 is the annual mean temperature, to the map. So if I run this, we can check that we have 20 bands here, elevation and bio 1 to bio 19. And this is our temperature layer display on the map. So we have the present absence data and our predictor variables. So the next step is similar to what you have been doing in the previous model, is train a classifier. The first thing we need to do is extract the pixel values for all our predictor bands. So we use the function sample regions on our predictors stack of bands we created. That's an image. Among the arguments we have to provide to sample regions, we need our points in present absence, the property we want to keep from that future collection, and the scale that we're sampling. So we're working at 1,000 meters here. That is the spatial resolution of the BioClim dataset. And another variable we want to create is take the band names of those predictors. That may be important later if we want to just use a subset of those bands and not all of them. For now, we're going to use the 20 predictor variables. So now we need to generate a classifier. And let's start first with a binary map. We use the EE.classifier smart random forest, and we specify how many trees we want. And we want to train this classifier using the pixel values. We're using the present absence as our response variable, and using all the bands. Once we create the classifier, we can classify the entire image to obtain a classified image. So we apply to our predictor variable the classifier using the function classify. This will create an image with present and absent pixels. So that's our predicted distribution for this hypothetical species. And we can display that in the map. So this is our predicted distribution for this model. Now we can also, instead of using a present absence or a 1-0 output, we can use this other line of code I have here, in which on top of the classifier, I can set out the output mode to probability. So that means instead of giving me a class 1 or 0, I will obtain the probability that the class is 1. So the rest is the same. We provide the train parameters. So now you see that when I run this code, the output I get now is a probability of the pixel to be present. So here we have our very first species distribution model using this hypothetical manually created dataset. In this next section, now we are going to get into more in-depth workflow using best practices to feed a species distribution model. I like this paper that came out from Ecography from Sruel et al. On standard protocols for reporting species distribution models. That gives you a framework for how we should think and approach these models. It's always important, the conceptualization, the overview. Why do we want this model? What's our goal? Are we trying to predict the species distribution? Are we trying to understand which variables are driving the occurrence of the species? Which species are we working? To have that in mind is crucial to having good output. Then is what type of data we're working with. Where are we getting this data? Is this citizen science data? Is this data we collected in a systematic way? Do we have presence-only data? Do we have presence and absence data? This will affect the different type of models we approaches. And in this course, we will focus a lot on presence-only data. But of course, always better to have true absences. Then, once we have the data, we have also environmental data with advantage of Cool Earth Engine. One of the main reasons we want to do this here, we have all this extensive catalog of satellite imagery and other remote sensing products. Then we have to feed model, and we have the different classifiers. Something we haven't done yet, but is crucial, is the assessment of how good that model is. So we have to get some kind of performance statistics on these models. So we need to incorporate that, and then we do our predictions. And then we look at those predictions at those assessment models, we overview the results, and we can continue with the cycle improving our models. It is important to understand what we want to do with these models. What are our questions? We're going to focus here on one of the two main things you can use models for. Like if you are interested in causal inference, trying to understand how a covariable affects the probability that a species occurs in certain areas at a certain time, then you are going to use, for example, a parametric GLM. But if your goal is to predict across space and time and obtain the best prediction possible, the best map possible, then you can go at a different road. Well, you are not interested on those mechanisms that explain the occurrence of species, but you are just interested in obtaining the best map possible. Models that predict really well don't necessarily get the relationship with the covariables well, and vice versa. Given the type of classifiers, non-parametric classifiers we are going to be using, mainly machine learning techniques, in Google Earth Engine, the workflow we use here has the main objective of have a good prediction. Google Earth Engine analysis on a species distribution model will not give you any information on causal inference or the side effects of the covariables on your present species. So that's important to keep in mind. With that clear, we're going to now move into the general workflow that we developed to fit the species distribution models in Google Earth Engine. And in this, the diagram shows all the steps that take place for the general model, the most basic one we're going to start with and develop. And this will serve as the basis for other adaptations. But first we need to load data into Google Earth Engine. And once you load the data, and that will come, and we will see it in a second, come as an asset, then we have to pre-process that. And that means defining the resolution we want to work with and removing any kind of extra or redundant data we have in our model can bias results. Once we have our final present only or present absence data set, we can choose our predictor variables. And again, we have a huge collection of remote sensing products available in Google Earth Engine. Once we have that, now depending again on the type of data we have, present absence is always recommended. But if we don't have absence data, then we will create pseudo-absences, and we will see more in detail later what we mean, and we will have different strategies that are being recommended by different authors on how we do that. Then there are different variations, is when I think Earth Engine can be super powerful, is for example, when we want to match the date of our data, our present pseudo-absences, to the date in which the images were collected. Let's say you have a presence from 2002, and at that point there was a forest cover, but if you are using an image from 2020 where that forest doesn't exist anymore, then the relationship between the presence location and the covariable may have a temporal mismatch. So Earth Engine it will give you the opportunity to account for that temporal aspect of the data. Then we will feed the models. There are different classifiers, and what we're going to do here is not just feed one random forest like we did last time, but do these multiple iterations. And we are going to also split the data for model feed and for model validation. So we have to validate that model, see how good they are at predicting independent data sets. And for this, we're going to use a multiple block cross-validation techniques, one of the most accepted techniques nowadays. And finally, we can do a model prediction by averaging the individual predictions over all those iterations. So this is basic overview, and now we can get to our code editor and start working. We're going to now work with the first example. We're going to use the Bradypus variegatus study case we include in the paper. And the reason for this is as a simple presence-only model from which we can build. So I'm going to show you all the steps on how and all the little tips and ways I work with this with Earth Engine to facilitate the modeling process. The first thing we need to do is get data. If you may have data from your fieldwork, or if you're more interested in doing some continental or large-scale analysis, you may go to GBIF. And I downloaded all the data for this case study using from GBIF. If you don't know how to access data here, you need an account, and I leave you on the folder of our workshop and step-by-step guideline on how to get that data. It will come as a CSV with many different columns of variables. I cleaned it up and kept only, you know that you can do some filtering in the website, or you can just do the filtering after. I just kept the name of the species, a column for the date in which that point was collected, and we need 2 columns for latitude and longitude. You can give it any name you want, and that has to be in WGA's 84 lat long projection system. That's the one that will come when you download from GBIF. Once we have that file, what we need to do is bring that as an asset. So we here is in this in the right panel where we have this tab assets, where we can manage all our assets. You can see here I have many of them. This is the data we're going to be using for this example. The way I got that data here is by going to new, and know that you can load raster data. If you have it as a shapefile, you can upload a shapefile, or if you have it as a CSV, and in my case, I'm going to upload a CSV. So the thing you need to do is select the folder where you have the data, and then once you have that, you can give it a proper name. Then there is an option for date. I have a date column there. It's going to automatically recognize it. Make sure you have it in this format of year, month, day. And then what you need to provide is exactly the same name you gave it to the latitude and longitude. So in my case, I call it lat long, so I will add here long and lat. And this is the WGA's 84 lat long projection system. And then I just click upload. And if you upload it, then you will see that it will work here in the tasks, and when it's completed, there are many different tasks I have been working with here, but once you complete it, it will show up in your assets. You may need to refresh it, and then you will get access to the data, and this is where it's going to be stored in your local user, so you can later access it and bring it into as an import. Now that we have our data in our assets, we can start actually working on our script. Note that the way I'm going to be working during this demonstration is basically the way I work with Google Earth Engine. The main difference with other coding languages like R, or like if you are familiar with R, Python, you can run lines, the script line by line. In Earth Engine, the entire script will run at once. What this means is that as you build your script, it gets larger and larger. Every time you click run, all the commands, all the functions will be called at the same time. You will see later how this gets a little messy if you are trying to edit an entire workflow, and then debugging if you find errors, trying to modify stuff, it becomes a little bit complicated if you are not organized. So I want to show you how I build my own workflow that help me or facilitate that process and allows you to reduce the memory that I'm using and calling, so we don't hit the memory limits and problems like that. More to talk as we progress with this workflow. Another thing, now that the code is long, I won't be typing everything, but I will be copying and pasting and working little by little. So the first thing we want to do is create some kind of header, and I'm going to go ahead and save this in our workshop, and we call this general work SDM workflow. So then you will have access to the script as well. So now I'm going to be dividing this in sections as we talk. And the first thing we're going to do is bring the data. So this will be our presence only data that we have as an asset. So this is the data set we'll be using. I made this data public, so you see, that here anyone can read. So you can call the data from that I have in my account. And it is under users Ramiro, Crego 84, Bradipus variegatus. And we will use the function feature collection to bring this data set. And I'm going to print the original data size, so how many presence records we have here. Click run, go to the console, and we see we have 571 points. Another thing we want to do now is define the grain size, so the size of the pixel that we want to work with. For this example, we'll be working with 1,000 meters by 1,000 meters. This is super important to think about when you're conceptualizing your model. What is your goal? What do you want from it? Also important is it's going to be related to the spatial resolution of your covariables, as well as what is that presence location representing? Is that presence location accurate enough to use a really high spatial resolution, or is better to use something smaller like 1,000 kilometers? So for this case, we're going to be using 1,000 by 1,000 meters. And what we want to do is try to reduce the bias on that presence data. This is citizen science data. So areas that are close to roads, certain parks probably are going to be more sampled, more recorded. So we have more points from those areas. And we don't want to bias the model with too many locations from the exactly same pixel. Like we have exactly same values for our covariables. We want to keep only one for each pixel. So that's here I built this function that I call it remove duplicates. That was the way I work around in Google Earth Engine to solve this problem. The idea is that I create a random image with this image random, and I force it to have, with a reproject function, to have this grain size, 1 by 1,000 kilometers. And you can modify this, you can hard code this to a different number if you're interested in reducing even more, thinning even more your data set. But the idea here is that we create one image where each pixel has a random value. Then we use the sample regions on this our data to extract that random pixel value from the random raster image. And then we use the distinct function to just keep 1 point from those from each pixel, because each pixel will share that random value, and then the distinct function will only keep 1 from those different points that share that random value from the pixel. As a result, we will get a thin data set, so we can print again the size of our data, and you see now we went to 323 presence points. So we have now a more clean data set that we can work with. You could save these, export this data as an asset, so you can have a little script that just cleans your data, so you avoid running this every time. Here we're working only with 500 points, 600 points around, so it's not going to be a big problem. But if you have a data set with maybe 5,000, 10,000 points, this may take longer. So if you don't want to run this every time you're running the script, because as I say, everything runs at the same time, you can export this as an asset again and keep the clean data set that then you can use in modeling. So then in another script, you just call the clean data set and start from there. I want to now plot this data. The way I wrote this example, because we are going to be trying to predict habitat suitability, so the probability of presence in a pixel, and also the potential distribution, and we want to rapidly visualize that. I want to divide the map in two, so I can plot one next to each other, as we have seen in the images I showed you earlier. How we do that in Earth Engine, how we divide this map. So far we have been working with just one map. It's pretty easy actually. What we need to do is define two UE maps, so a left and right they call it, and then we just clear the root map and add this new the new left and right maps that we define it, and then we link them together, and we need to provide a name, which is not necessary. But the idea now that since before we were using map add layer to add data, so now we define the left and the right. So what we do now is, instead of using map add layer, as you will do if you haven't divided the map, you use right and left. So now when I run this, what is happening is that I have two maps, and it's going to be displaying the data in both maps, and both maps are linked, so they move together. It's pretty cool. The next thing we want to do is define the area of interest we want to work with. So it's that put a limit where we are going to be cropping our predictor variables and we want to do the predictions. This is another critical step on your conceptualization of your model. You generally don't want to be predicting really far away from where you are actually training your model. Sometimes it doesn't even make any sense to try to predict, for example, habitat suitability in the ocean here, or in Antarctica, to put an extreme example. But you want to really think about how you link your grain size with your extent. Fortunately for Earth Engine, the pixel size is not as a problem as it is in R, because the amount of memory you will need if you increase the spatial resolution of your rasters. So that's a big advantage in Earth Engine, that Earth Engine will have no problem in displaying high resolution imagery. But keep in mind that if you export a 90 or 100 meter resolution, it's going to be much heavier, much more data than you export a 1000 by 1000 spatial resolution. It also has to do with how we do measure accuracy of our models, how increasing the area of interest can bias and inflate your accuracy assessments. We will talk more about that later. So, section 2, define the area of interest. There are many ways you can do this around. You can manually generate a polygon, but what I'm going to be doing here is automatically selecting a bounding box around the location data we have. So we get from the data the geometry, extract the geometry of our feature collection, and then get the bounds of that geometry, so the maximum and minimum latitude coordinates and maximum and minimum longitude coordinates. But then I don't want to just limit it just to the limit of that point, so I want to add a buffer around that bounds, and in this case I'm just adding 50 kilometers. So this is distance in meters in that buffer, and always when you use the buffer function, add the maximum error to make it more efficient, this function. The buffer function in Earth Engine can give you some headaches, so always good to have some large maximum error allowed. Once we have that, we'll define our area of interest, and then we can add it to the map as a polygon, but what we want to actually visualize is the outline of that area of interest. So all what this code is doing is just painting the pixels on the border of that area of interest. So then I'm adding it to the right and the left maps. And then next thing I want to do is center the map to my area of interest, and I give it a zoom level. So now when I run, automatically is going to center to my area of interest. So you have here the study area, bounding box, and the presence locations. So now that we have the clean data, presence data, and we have our area of interest defined, The next step is going to be to select predictor variables for our analysis. And here is where having a workflow that works directly in Google Earth Engine is where I believe it brings most of the benefits. Remember that we have a huge catalog of data sets to select from. And this includes weather data, you see, all kind of climatic variables. We have raw satellite imagery to use, and I will talk a little bit more about towards the end about using that kind of data sets for a species distribution model. But we also have terrain that's commonly used, different types of land cover products. On top of that, you can also create your own predictor variables. For example, you saw before how you can transform or use satellite information to create your own land cover image, and then you can use that as a predictor variable for your species of interest. There is also, I want to show you these awesome Google Earth Engine community datasets. It's like an initiative to compile datasets that are still not available on Google Earth Engine servers. And this, I invite you here to look into this website because there's so much more information, generally papers, where all the products from those papers, the rasters are made available here, like from soil, elevation, geography. There's so much stuff here. So yeah, this is a really good place to take a look at. A lot of potential different data sets that could be really useful as predictor variables for your study. And there is no need to download anything of these data. It doesn't matter how big your extent is or your spatial resolution. You're not going to be downloading gigabytes of raster data sets. Everything will be here on the servers of Google. So to me, that's one of the main, or it was one of the main motivations to create this workflow in Google Earth Engine. Selecting your predictor variables means here's where we are going to be having the most of the input as researchers, and which variables you use depends a lot on your objectives and what is the species you're working with. In this case, for the Bradypus variegatus, and now we're going to use some simple rasters that we're bringing terrain, so elevation. Then we're going to be using percentage tree cover at a 250 meter resolution from a Terra Modis vegetation continuous field. And we are going to bring also the bioclaim variables that you are probably familiar with. So I'm going to paste this code here. So this is the bioclaim we used before in the previous example, the simple example. Then we have again terrain. And then this is the Modis product. And in this case, we have an image per year. So what we want to do is use some of those functions we have been learning and filter this product. So we don't want to use the entire collection. We want to create just one image. So we are filtering for the time span of the data set. So we have points presence data from 2003 to 2020. So we keep all those years. We select percent tree cover, and then we extract the median of that collection to get just one image. And once we have all those rasters together, what we want to do is combine them, so stack them into one single product. And I can print this image. So we can see here that we have a total of 24 bands. So the 19 bioclimate plus elevation plus slope plus aspect plus hillshade plus pleasant tree cover. Because as I forgot to mention here, I brought the elevation, but then I apply the EE algorithm terrain to calculate slope, aspect, and hillshade as well. So that's the set of bands that we have to work with. The next thing we want to do is remove all those pixels that we don't want to keep in the analysis. That means all the oceans, and sometimes you may want to exclude lakes, etc. So what we need to do is create a mask. So remember the concept of a mask. Masking refers to setting certain pixels from the image with no data values. So we exclude them from the analysis. So we create a mask, and those are the pixels we want to keep. So in this case, what we're going to do is remove the oceans. And sometimes the different products may have different borders. So we just use the elevation data set to say, okay, everything that is below 0 meters, we want to exclude it. So from the terrain, what we're going to do is select elevation and then keep everything that is greater than 0. This is our mask. And then what we use is the update mask to the predictor's image, and we apply that water mask which has created. And on top of that, we're going to clip this, because we're still working with worldwide data sets. We're going to clip it to our area of interest. Now that we have the entire set of images, we may want to display some of them of the map. It's always good to actually visualize the data sets. In this case, what we're going to do is, remember that I changed it now the root of the map, so we have right and left. So I'm going to display on the right some of these bands. So from the predictor's image, I'm going to select, for example, elevation, and I provide a minimum and a maximum, as we have been doing, a palette, and I give it a name, and the 0 means it's not going to be displayed immediately, so I will have to activate it. Then I'm going to predict bio 5, bio 12, precipitation, and percent tree cover. And now we are in the layers in the right. I'm going to activate, for example, percent tree cover. So here it is. Then we have annual mean precipitation, or we can look at temper seasonality, and we can take a look at elevation. So that's some examples. You can play around and keep displaying some of the other ones by changing the name of the band you want to display and the min max parameters, and also you can play around with palettes. Fantastic. So now we have created our set of predictor variables. Now there is a next decision we have to make, is whether to use the entire set of predictor variables for modeling, or select a subset this long list of bands. And here we created a function to actually estimate the correlation among predictor variables. So it may be the case that you want to keep only variables that are not really highly correlated. And this idea comes from the problem of multicollinearity. And this is a problem where two variables provide basically the same information to the model, and then it can generate a confounding effect in which the parameter estimates can be obscuring some actual important effects. But this is actually relevant when you are trying to model a causation, so when you're trying to understand how different covariables affect the probability of presence of your species. Now, we said before that the workflow we're building here is specifically aiming to have accurate predictions. And that's related to machine learning techniques we're using here as classifiers. So then multicollinearity is not a big issue if you're using, for example, random forests. And they are pretty strong to the effect of collinearity, and it will give you really good predictions anyway. So you may want to not run this and run, as some authors just incorporate all the list of bands into the classifier. You may also want to use a little bit more of ecological knowledge and say, well, I only want to keep certain number of predictor variables. So that's where your experience as a modeler comes into it, and where you make the decisions. So I'm going to show you now how we are going to estimate the correlation among all the variables here in Wood Thrush Engine. And while this may take a while to run, it's a more memory expensive process. basically what we are doing is extracting 5,000 random points with a function sample, and then extracting the value of all those points, for those 5,000 points across all bands, and then we are taking all those pixel values across all the different predictor variables we have in our image and calculating the Spearman correlation. You could change these to a Pearson correlation if interested. And then we're extracting that correlation value and printing it as a matrix. So in each one will be correlating, so basically in the same order of the bands that are in the list. So here bio 1, bio 2, bio 3, with each of them respectively. It's not the most efficient way of seeing these correlations, but you can also export it if you want, but then you can analyze and see that bio 1 is highly correlated with bio 6 and so on. So you could use this list to select your variables. Once this is, again, expensive process, it takes really long, so you don't want to print this list every time you run again. So you want to comment it out once you have look at your predictor variables and select the ones you want. In this case, we're going to be working with temperature seasonality, maximum temperature of the warmest month and minimum temperature of the coldest months. And generally, the literature says that more extreme climatic variables are better predictors for the range of species. And then we're using annual precipitation together with elevation and percentage tree cover. So once we have a list of names of bands, we can just select those bands and keep only those as our new predictor variables. Now we can move to a new section, section 4. Here we are going to define the area to create pseudo-absences and spatial blocks for cross-validation. So let's start with this idea of pseudo-absences. Ideally, in species distribution models and in any kind of occurrence model, habitat suitability model, you will have presence and absence data that you collected on the field. So you know where the species are and where the species is not. However, in SDMs, most of the cases, you don't have that kind of information. You're relying on presence-only data. And this is where the idea of the pseudo-absence comes in. It's a little bit complicated thinking, philosophically speaking, because we don't have data on where the species is not. So we could say, okay, let's extract information from what we know the species is not, and we go to the middle of the ocean. But then it's not really informative model. So it gets a little complicated. There is a lot of controversy on how we do this, because it can affect your accuracy assessment, etc. But we offer 3 different options in this workflow, and let's walk through them. Before we even start defining the area for pseudo-absences, so where we're going to sample for the model, for the absence locations, we have to mask out the presence locations. So we are not randomly getting data for absences where we have presences. So we want to create the mask here using the presence data. So we reduce that to an image using the grain size that we defined earlier. You could increase the grain size if you want to increase the area around your presence locations, like a minimum distance where you don't want absences. The first option we have is to just use the entire area of interest to create pseudo-absences. We define the entire landscape as a background where we can randomly sample pseudo-absences. This may be an approach you use in an algorithm like Maxent. So what we're doing here is, from the mask we just created, we update that mask with a water mask that we created before, and then we clip it to the area of interest. Then we can add this to the map to visualize it. And basically, we are defining everything in the land besides those areas where the presence locations are actually located. So we will see here this in black all the areas available for randomly generating pseudo-absences. So let me zoom in here so you can see actually how where you have presences, the pixels are actually masked. Let me find presence here. So if I zoom in there, you see that pixel is masked, or let me go into an area with more points. The pixels are removed, and then no random value will fall where the presence are. Again, you can increase the size of that pixel by changing this parameter of grain size. Good. Now let's move to option 2. So in this, some people argue that instead of using your entire study area, you should limit that area to areas that where the species could potentially disperse. So if you have that type of information of how far animals disperse from your species of interest, then you can set a buffer around your data. So in this case, I'm using 500 kilometers as an example. So from the data, we create a buffer, and then the entire mask we created before, we're going to clip it to that area for pseudo-absences. And then we also update that mask to eliminate the oceans and clip it towards area of interest, and we can take a look at that now. So you will see that instead of having the entire area of interest available, we are limiting that to the 500 kilometers around all our presence locations. The third option that has been proposed more recently, and that actually helps improve your accuracy metrics, is what we call it environmental profiling. So let me walk you through this process because it's a little bit more complicated. But the idea is that we are going to use our presence data to cluster, so to create like using the information we know from where a species occurs, identify across the landscape, across the area of interest, all those pixels that are similar. And we use a cluster. Basically, we cluster those pixels in two clusters. One that is similar, using this Euclidean distance to our presence, and a cluster will be dissimilar. And then we will create pseudo-absences, or limited the area to create pseudo-absences on all those pixels that are highly dissimilar to the conditions where the species we know is present. So this is what we're going to do. First, take all our predictors and sample from 200 or 300, whatever amount you want. Gather all that information from all the bands you have, and we save it as this object pixel values. The reason I'm using just 200 is because if you use a large number, you may get into memory limits on Google Earth Engine. And in this case, we really want to be able to visualize that cluster. Then we use this cluster, which means we want two clusters with we use the Euclidean distance algorithm, and we train that cluster using the pixel values. And then we take our predictors and cluster those predictors into two classes using the cluster that we just created. And then we can visualize those clusters. Something that is kind of strange, but the way this function works in Earth Engine is that cluster 1 and 2 are going to change randomly, even using the same data. Sometimes the one cluster is level 1 and one cluster level 2, and you don't know which one is which. So what you want to do is make sure you are actually selecting the cluster that is a similar one. The way I automated that was by using the cluster result, sampling the value from those same 200 points that we used before, and then extract the mode, so the most common cluster for the presence data, and then select the actually opposite side of the cluster and use that to as the area to create pseudo-absences. So let me print it out and we will see it. So these are the result of the cluster. So in violet we have the things that are similar to our presence locations, and in green the dissimilar one to the presence locations. So now all these black areas are going to be used to select pseudo-absences. So yeah, this is a novel methodology you will see more frequently implemented in papers in the last year. And it's the one that we are going to use now and continue with. So what I'm going to do is comment out this one and comment out this one and keep our third option for the next steps in the model. The next step is to define blocks that we are going to use for cross-validation. But before we get into the code, let's talk a little bit about what the idea behind cross-validation. So it's actually pretty simple, but if we have a complete set of data, the idea is that we can divide that into k parts that we use for training the model, and then the rest of that bag of data we use it for testing. Yeah, so we could basically split our data into two data sets. One we use for training and one we use for testing. So in training we have present and absence data, and in testing we also have another set of present and absence. So if our model is good in predicting our test data from our data we train, then we can rely on that model. And the idea is that we randomly split this data set multiple times, multiple iterations, and then we see how consistent our model outputs are to the randomness on how we split and how we select that present and absence data. In the past, people, or still being used, will use just all the points and split directly the points. The problem with this is many times you split for testing a validated points that are really spatially next to each other or close to each other. And then you probably are inflating your accuracy matrices because it's really easy for the model probably to predict something that is really similar to the data that was used for fitting. So more recently, the idea of the blocks was introduced. So we define blocks and then we split the blocks, and blocks will contain the data. So some blocks will be used for training and some blocks will be used for testing. And then we are ensuring that the data we use for training and testing come from are more spatially separated, so are more independent. Let's get back to the code now and let's create that grid. So here is the code after I printed the area for pseudo-absences, which I will turn to 0 so it doesn't show automatically when I run again the code. But this function here, don't worry too much about it, but this just creates a grid. Yeah, so there are two arguments that we need to pass: the geometry where we want the grid to be created and the scale. So the size in meters of each block. So that's the scale we're going to define here. In this case, I'm using 200 by 200 kilometer blocks. And then I'm going to apply this function to the area of interest and at these meters that I defined. So don't worry about this, but it's just making sure you have a grid covering your entire area of interest. And if I run it, it will show you the grid on top of the area of interest. There you go. So that's the grid they are going to use, those blocks, to split into training and validation. I put together a quick code here with colors to demonstrate how this idea of the k-fold cross-validation works. So here I just creating blocks, a little bigger to visualize. And in blue we have what randomly 70% has been selected for training, and in red will be the blocks that will be used for testing. So we see, so if I turn off all the testing, we have now in blue the presence data, in green will be random pseudo-absence data, and now if I put there, these are the blocks randomly selected for testing. These are the presence data sets that fall within those blocks, and these are the absence random points, pseudo absences, actually points that were selected or created for testing. This is the randomness of this split depends on a seed, so I can change this number, and now you will see that the split of the blocks will be different. So every time we change that seed, we get a different division or selection. We get there and again a new division. This is the base for what we will see later on how we do iterations and create pseudo absences and split the present pseudo absences in training and testing. It's important also to don't define a really small block, because then if your blocks are too small, then we end up with this idea that the blocks are not actually splitting data, the present and data by space, like they are far apart. But you don't, if you have data sets like this one that are kind of clustered, you don't want big blocks either that are going to basically randomly many times just get all the data for training and only a few points for validation, or the other way around, like you get only few points for model fitting and most of the data is within one block for validation. So you have to play with that threshold, like, and depending on the type of data set that you have. So now we have all the elements to start actually modeling. So the next thing we're going to do is go into section 5 of this workflow, that is fitting the SDMs. So for that we have a function, the SDM function, that's going to be the bulk of this workflow. And before we go into the details of that, what's inside that function, I want to show you these two arguments we're going to use, and that is the split. So remember we talked about splitting the data set into, or the blocks, into modeling and validation. So that's the proportion we want to use. Here is a 70%, that's more like the norm in the literature, or you can use 80%. But you split, you use that for training, and then the rest 30% for validation. And then we want to do that many times, many iterations. So that number of iterations, we will define it here. In this case, we can use 10. It's probably appropriate for an analysis. We could use 4 or 5 for running faster and for this exercise. Now that I talk about that, let me walk you through this SDM function. What we're going to do with this function is apply it on a list of random numbers. And so we can generate this seed. And the seed is important, so we ensure that every iteration we create different random numbers. So when we split blocks, they are split differently, as I showed you in the little demonstration before. So we get that number from the list and create an object, the variable called seed, that we are going to use along this iteration. The first thing we want to do is split that grid into block for testing and block for validation. So here we take to each feature in that collection and we generate a random number with a random column function. And here's where we have to specify a seed, so we don't get, if we don't do that, then at each iteration we always going to get a default seed, so we will have the same, exactly same split every time. And then we want to sort it by that random number, and the default is ascending, so from 0 to 1. So now we have each of these blocks, each future, we have random numbers. So what we want to do is all those blocks, filter them by lower than the 0.7 in this case. So we are keeping from all the random number blocks with random number from 0 to 0.69 as blocks for model fitting. And then the rest we are going to filter for greater than equals. So the greater than equals 0.7, so the other 30% numbers larger than 0.7 will be blocks for testing. So now we have our blocks for training and testing. The next thing we want to do is, get all the data and split that data now. Get the ones that are within the blocks that we define that are for training as one set, will be the presence for model fitting, and then the other set of presence for model validation. So what we do here is take the data, the presence points, and then what we want to add is a property that tells that is present. So we create a property here, and we set the property present absence with a 1. So these are presence data. And then we filter again by bounds, so everything that is within the training grid, we keep it for training presence, and everything that is within the testing grid, we keep it for testing purposes. So here we have the training and the testing points, presence points. If you have true absences, as we said before, it's always better, you will do the same for your absence data. In that case, you will already have set the ones and zeros before you imported the data into Google Earth Engine as an asset, the first step that we did. In that case, you will have that column already there. So you can filter by that property and separate the presence and the absences. But now we don't have. In this case, we're working with pseudo-absences. So we created that area before for pseudo-absences. So what we want to do is generate random points within that area for pseudo-absences, yeah? And here comes a decision you have to make in how many random points you want, how many pseudo-absences. The literature shows that for when you're working with machine learning techniques, like what we do here, like random forests or boosting regression trees, then having a balanced data set gives you better performance. So you basically want to have the same amount of presence than absences. And that's the method we implement here. Of course, if you want to have more numbers, you can just increase the number of random points. The limitation using this strategy of a balanced data set is that if you have a rare species or you're working with a few points, then this methodology won't be useful. And you probably want to use maxent. Keep in mind that the maxent algorithm is available in Earth Engine now. But for what we're going to be doing here is using random forests or boosting regression trees, we want a balanced data set. So we want to create pseudo-absences, random points we have to define a region for the sample function. And then we provide a scale argument, that's the grain size that we defined before. And here's the number of pixels we want. So in this case, I'm just saying, I want the same numbers of the size of the training presence points. But then I'm adding some extra. And the reason I'm doing that is that you want to do that when you're working with a coastline or when you have a lake you're masking out. Because many times the random points are going to be generating within this training grid. So that's the region. So then what happens is basically it's using the extent of that area. So many random points will land or will fall on the water. So then when you try to extract values, they are outside your area of interest, your rasters, your covariables, you will get NAs, and those points will be discarded. And you may end up with much less pseudo-absence than you intended to. So you want to add a few extra there depending on how large your presence is, how many more you want to have. And you may have to do some trial and error and check always that you have a balanced data set when you look at the training data. Here again, we want to have a seed that we determine. So every time we create a different set of random points. And then we want to keep the geometry of those random points. And the tile scale, we set it to 16 just for memory purposes, for efficiency. So to avoid having memory limits. Then once we created those training points, we created more than we needed. Then we are going to, again, generate the random column and limit the number to exactly the same amount of presences. So we end up with exactly the same amount of pseudo-absences than presence. So again, this is in case that many points fall within the oceans and you don't want to end up with a really smaller data set or a smaller amount of pseudo-absences than presences. Then we have to set the property, same property, absence. This has to be exactly the same as here. And but in this case is a 0. That indicates these are pseudo-absences. So in this case, we just created the training pseudo-absence points. Then we want to do the same, but in this case, we are using the testing grid instead of the training grid. So for the area of pseudo-absences, we're using the testing grid. All the same thing. Again, you want to add some extra. In this case, you don't need as many as the training because in testing you have less amount of points. And then the rest is all the same. So here we end up with 4 variables: the training presence point, the testing presence point, the training pseudo-absence point, and the testing pseudo-absence points. All we need to do now is merge the training data together to form the training partition and the testing data to form the testing partition. The next step here is to extract for the training data the pixel values on all our predictor bands in our predictor image. So we use again the sample regions function on the training partition. And the property we want to keep is that present absence because that's the response variable of our model. We use the grain size, so we are sampling at the grain size we defined earlier. And again, we are using a tile scale 16 to improve efficiency. So now we've got to the point where we're fitting a classifier. So what we did initially in that simple model. Here we have the random forest, but you can also activate, so comment out the smile gradient tree boost, the boosting regression tree. So in case you want to use that method. Now I'm going to continue with the default, that is the random forest. I will use 500 trees. And then here are all the different arguments of that classifier. And we are going to use the defaults here. So once we train the classifier, the next thing is to set out the model. And we want to do this twice. We want to do one for probability and one for classification. And we'll talk a little bit more about why we're doing the binary this way here and which other options we have to obtain a binary map, a potential distribution of 0, a present absence map. But now for rapid visualization, we want to use this method. So for each iteration, we get a probability map or a habitat suitability map and a potential distribution map. And then our classifier, we will train it with the training pixel values, and the response variable is our present absence property. And we want to use all the bands. So we remember we generated the band names list before. So those are all the bands we're going to use as the explanatory variables. So once we trained that classifier, now we can classify our predictors. In this case, you don't need to select this. Bands we're selecting are the same as the bands we have in the predictors because we filtered before. But if you don't do that, it will be done here. So we only work with the bands you defined. And then we just classify that image using this classifier. And we do that again to obtain the presence probability and the binary map. What this function is returning is a list of things. So we want, so in Earth Engine, we are mapping this function on a list. What we get back is also a list. And here we have the habitat suitability prediction, the presence absence of binary prediction, and then we want to keep the training partition and the testing partition. This is the default function. You could modify this. For example, Earth Engine gives you the possibility to extract the variable importance from the classifier, random forest classifier, not all of the classifiers. So if you want to add that, you could add that to this list to get an extra output. But that would require more coding. So for the general workflow here, we wrote in a way you don't need to modify anything, and you will get these 4 outputs. So we have here our function, and then again the split and the number of iterations. Once we define this function, the next thing is to actually run the models. So here we can do different things. So what we want again is random seed, right? So we wrote a function that will create random numbers. So let me show you here. This is a function. If I say 6 iterations, 6 random numbers, I get 6 random numbers. If I do 8, I can get 8 random numbers. And if I run it again, they will be all different. So that's one way of randomizing those seeds. But if you want your results to be reproducible, you want to manually set those numbers. So you could run this function on a different script and then copy and paste those numbers here, or you can just use a calculator or just some random numbers that you can put here, and depending how many iterations, how many numbers you are going to create. To be able to all get the same results, I'm going to just use the same first 5 numbers here in this list. So if I using 5 in the iterations, I create a list with 5 random numbers, and then to this list I can map the SDM function. That all the results will be compiled into that results variable. The next thing we want to do is to flatten that list of lists into a one long list, and then we can print that so we can visualize all the results we get. So here are the list of 20. In this case, we have 4 elements that we are saving 5 times, so we get 20 elements. So in that order, we have the image, the classified habitat suitability. Then we get the predicted binary map, again the future collection that is training, and then the testing for the first run. And that will repeat as many iterations as you have done. Now I'm going to comment out this, so I don't want to print it again. But we move to section 6. Let's start to visualize some of these maps. The tricky part here is how we get all the elements from this list that we want at each time. So let me show you quickly how we do that. So let's start with the habitat suitability predictions. We set here some visualization parameters with a palette to display the map. And this is the important part to extract those images that we want. Basically, what we want to do is create a sequence that goes, remember the first index in JavaScript is 0. So we want the 0, we want the next element, we want the 4, the next element, we want the 8, and so on, depending how many iterations you have. So what we want to do is create a list that goes from 0 to the number of iterations times 4, so 20, but we want to subtract 1 because the maximum here is 19, because we're starting from 0 again. And we want that every 4, so we want this. And this will create a list of numbers that goes 0, then 4, then 8, and so on. And then what we want to do to those numbers in that list is map a function that basically gets that element from the list. So what we do is create a variable now with only the images we want. In this case, only the habitat suitability predictions. And then when we have that, we can add one by one for each iteration that to the map. But our final result we want is to get the average of all those iterations. Yeah. So that will be our final map. The average from that image collection. So we use the image collection from the list, and then we extract the mean. And that will be our final model. And we can run that, and we can add the presence points on top. And while that runs, we can also do the same for the present absence data. Then the next, something I forgot to add here is a little bit of code to add a legend into the map. Just see how quickly this is running. That's something that always impressed me. But the next thing we need to do is the same thing, but for the present absence map. So the distribution map. We're going to do the same to extract the second list of image, that is the present absence image. We want to go from the 1 now. We start on 1 and do the same thing, extract all the values. So we want the 1, the 5th, and so on. And what we are doing here is, because we have a present absence output from each iteration, we're going to do, in this case, the final map is a majority vote. So we get the mode of that for each pixel, for whatever was most predicted by each iteration, we get the mode, and that's the final present or absence for that pixel. And then we add another legend here. So let me run this again. And so we have the legends in our map. And this is the idea to rapidly visualize the results, and then we can export them. It takes less than a minute for these iterations, even though in the video I speeded up the process to actually show you the final results of the habitat suitability and the predicted distribution for the species. The next thing now is to get into validate, using that validation set, and see how good the actual predictions are. There are two big groups of matrices to do model validation. Those that are threshold dependent and then are based on the confusion matrix, and we will look into sensitivity and specificity, and those that are threshold independent, and those are the area under the curve of the receiver operator characteristic and the area under the precision recall. Threshold dependent validation metrics are based on the confusion matrix. So the idea, we are comparing our validation data set, so what we know are presence and absences, against what the model predicted as presence and absences. So we will have true positives, so those cases where the model correctly predicted the presence, false positive, where the model incorrectly predicted the presence, in reality was an absence, then false negatives, where the model incorrectly predicted an absence, where in reality is a presence, and the true negatives, where the model correctly predicted an absence. We want to maximize those true positives and true negatives and minimize the false positive and false negative. The most straightforward indexes that we can get from the confusion matrix is the sensitivity and the specificity. Sensitivity refers to the percentage of cells that were correctly predicted as presences, and the specificity is the percentage of cells correctly predicted as absences. And those are simple metrics, but again, you need to define a threshold for those model predictions to say what is a presence and what pixel is an absence. Here to show you how the threshold can affect those sensitivity and specificity matrices, let's consider this example with 6 pixels where we have our testing presence data marked by the crosses, and the rest are absences. And then our predicted probability, ranging from 0 to 1. If we use a threshold of 0, then everything will be positive, right? And then we correctly predicted 3, we over-predicted presence, right? We have no absences. If we use a threshold of 0.1, then we have that those 3 pricks are absences, and the rest in green are the presences. So we correctly predicted 3 absences, correctly predicted 3 presences, but over-predicted 3 presences as well. If we increase that threshold, we start to get a more balanced present-absence in the map, but that will affect your sensitivity and specificity. Now we have 2 correctly predicted presence and 4 correctly predicted absences. And you can calculate how sensitivity and specificity is changing in this case. The other set of validation matrices are threshold independent. Let's start with the area under the curve of the receiver operator characteristic. It provides one single measure of model performance and ranges from 1 to 0. The idea here is that we plot sensitivity versus 1 minus specificity across a gradient of thresholds. So we go from 0 to 1, and what we want to do is this plot to get as closer as possible to the upper left corner. So when the area under this curve approaches to 1, that means we have a perfect discrimination between presence and absences in the model prediction. If we get like a 45 degrees curve, or be a line, so then the area under the curve will be 0.5. That means that the discrimination of the model is no better than random performance, so it's a really bad model. So we want IUCs that are closer to 1. If we get something below 0.5, that means that the performance is even worse than random. The problem with AUCs, as I'm going to demonstrate shortly, is that as you increase the area to select pseudo-absences, then you will increase the IUC metric, basically because you are easily correctly predicting more absences. So that this method has been largely criticized, even though it's the most widely used metrics in SDM models. You should not use it if you only have presence-only data. You only use it when you have present and absence data. Despite the AUC ROC being broadly applied as a model validation criterion in SDM analysis, it's important to know that it has been criticized as a metric, validation metric, when using only presence data sets. The problem with the AUC ROC is it tends to inflate, to increase the value as you increase the area to select pseudo-absences, so outside the environmental domain of presence locations. This implies that the AUC ROC will inflate for species that are narrowly distributed or for rare species. As I can show you here, if we run the model we are building with limiting the study area around our presence locations and using the entire study area to select pseudo-absences, we get an AUC ROC of 0.87. But if I increase manually that area of interest using geometry here, so I go far north and farther south in the continent, then I inflate that AUC to 92% or 0.92. So here you see same data, same present data, same grain size, everything the same covariates, and I just get a much higher AUC just by increasing the study area. So recently, Sofer et al. Proposed a new metric that is less sensitive to the absence locations for when we have presence-only data, and this is the area under the curve of the precision recall. This metric relies on sensitivity, or we can also call it recall, and the precision. So the true positives divided by the true positive plus the false positives. And it also ranges from 0 to 1, similar to the AUC ROC, with 1 indicating perfect discrimination between presence and pseudo-absences. And then in this case, random, not better than random, means that the AUC is equal to the presence prevalence of the data. And because in this workflow we're using the same amount of presence and absences, the prevalence will be 0.5. So a metric of 0.5 indicates no better than random. So here what you are trying to maximize 1, so this curve wants to go to the upper right corner. And we are plotting precision against sensitivity or recall for a gradient of thresholds. So again, this is the metrics we should be using for presence-only datasets. If you have presence and absence, you can use the area under the curve of the receiver operator characteristic. So we can now move back to the workflow and start with section 7. I'm going to paste all the code from that section here. It's not really important to understand all these functions, but we need to have them there to extract the validation matrices. So the first thing we're doing is, as before, extracting the validation set that we set apart for actually validating our predictions. Something we want to do here is to double check that the amount of presence and absences that we have for model validation are enough. This is because what we talked before, that sometimes when the random split of the blocks can result in basically having just no presence data in 30% of random blocks. So you want to make sure that you have enough validation data. If not, you will have to change the seed for that run because you probably end up with a model that has no data for validation. Then comes the function to calculate the area under the curve. We have one for the rock, AUC rock, and we also have one for the AUC PR. So again, don't need to worry about what's going on inside of these functions, but what we care is about the matrices that we're printing out. So in this case, even though we have presence-only data, I'm using both showing how to calculate the area under the curve of the receiver and operator characteristic, and also we're getting the area under the curve of the precision recall. Those are the threshold independent matrices. The next set of matrices are sensitivity and specificity, and these ones depend on a threshold. And we say before, getting a threshold can be tricky. Here we're using a threshold that maximizes the sum of sensitivity and specificity, as has been shown to perform better for presence-only data. We will get all these metrics printed out here in the console. After a while, everything finished running. Let's start from here, where we can see the list of presence and pseudo-absences that were used in each run to validate the model for these different validation metrics. Again, we want to make sure you have enough, and the different numbers depends on where the blocks how the blocks are being randomly splitted. And generally, if you get a block in this area with more clustered presences, you will get a higher number probably in the second run. Here we have a list of, we have 5 iterations, so the IUC rock value for each iteration and a mean among all the iterations. And then we have the precision recall for each iteration and the mean for those 5 iterations. Then we have sensitivity as the percentage of correctly predicted presences, and specificity with a percentage of correctly predicted absences, all using that threshold that maximizes sum of sensitivity and specificity, and this is the mean across the 5 runs. The last step I want to show you is step 8. That is how we create a binary map, but this time using this mean threshold that summarizes specificity and sensitivity for our model predictions. So what we have displayed before is the maximum vote. So now we want to get that model prediction, the habitat suitability prediction, and then use the function greater than equals that threshold. So we transform that into this binary map. So now we can add that to the map as we did before and wait until the process finished. The main problem with this approach will be what we call the timeout error. So in Google Earth Engine, we have two ways of operating, on-the-fly mode and batch mode. The on-the-fly is everything we have been doing. So we write some code, we send that to the Google server, and then Google server brings the results and we can display them on our screen. This has a 5 minutes limitation. That means any operation that takes more than 5 minutes, because it's highly intensive computationally speaking, will give you back an error. And the idea here is that we are not saturating the server, so we can all use it as a community. If you want to run an operation that takes longer and is more computationally intensive, then we use what we know as the batch mode. That basically means what will be the next step and the final step, exporting the results to a Google Drive or Google server. In this case, with just 5 iterations for this model, with only 570 presence points, we see that the binary map, it's printed on the fly mode. So you can turn this out and on and see the difference between the two approaches on how that prediction differs. Now, if I increase here the number of iterations to 10, that is what you would probably be required, and then I use another seeds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and run this, the most likely situation is that it's going to time out. And after a little bit of waiting, you can see here you get this error, potential distribution 2 layer error, an internal error has occurred. So what we want to do is then don't display this on the map, and to use the batch mode, basically what we are doing is exporting, as we have seen before, all our products to Google Drive. So we use the export image to drive. You can also export as an asset, as we have seen before, but the same thing. You get your image, you provide the name, the grain size that you're working with, and the area of interest, the maximum number of pixels, and we export these. The same thing we do with distribution map. For the distribution map using the threshold, we can also run this unmask minus 9999. That means everything that has been masked out in the image here, you will transform the value to minus 9999. That is for then in QGIS to recognize this as background and not as the zeros. We can also export all our matrices as CSVs, and we can also export our training and testing data sets. When I run this, know that, as you probably know at this point, you have to run these tasks here before you do any of these, and you want to send it to Google Drive or as an asset, and you can also provide a folder name. And with that, we complete this general framework. Now you have the basic structure to run an SDM in Google Earth Engine. Now we have seen the basic workflow on how to fit a species distribution model using Google Earth Engine. And you may say, but Ramiro, I can't do that model using R or some of the most common SDM softwares. And that's true. Like we use an example where the predictor variables are simple and it may not take that much more time to run the same model using Maxent or using Biomod in R or the Dismo package. But we put together this workflow with two main goals. One is that you can take this code, and for someone in a place where getting access to a lot of rasters can be complicated, and having to put on a stack of raster, making sure everything is on the same resolution, changing raster resolutions can take time. It's a process that consumes memory, it is demanding. And here you can change the data set on this workflow, and with minimal edits. Of course, you may want to change the grain size, you may want to change the different predictor variables. Remember, there are many options available just with one line of code in Earth Engine. And then you can, for example, here quickly obtain a species distribution model for Tapirus terrestris, the South American tapir. And you can obtain a lot of data sets from GBIF or from other sources and quickly upload them into Google Earth Engine and obtain the model. We think this can be super useful for decision-making processes for many organizations. The second goal was to take advantage of the high computing processing for rasters that Google Earth Engine offers. Not everybody has access to a supercomputer in their institutions or like unlimited amount of storage to download rasters from the internet. And recent studies have demonstrated the benefits of using, for example, unclassified multispectral satellite images as predictor variables. Using the unclassified multispectral data from, for example, Landsat offers the benefit of avoiding the errors of misclassified pixels in land cover products. However, processing large numbers of multiband satellite imagery like Landsat or Sentinel is highly demanding and requires several gigabytes of data to download and storage, particularly if your study area is large and you have multiple images to compile. So to finalize this class, I want to show you how we can use Landsat raw data to predict the distribution of the wood thrush. This is the wood thrush data I'm using here. This is the data set we use in the paper if you read it. These are around 100,000 locations from the month of June between 2018 and 2020. And I downloaded this from GBIF. This is eBird data. So what I want to do is load this data set, but also from the Tigers stage, just load the state of Illinois. I'm going to do this model for the state of Illinois only. So in this case, I'm merging section 1 and 2, here showing you how you can be flexible and modify the code for your needs. So we need to define the area of interest because I want to filter by bounds now. And from the entire data set for all the eastern continental USA, I want to keep only data from Illinois. And after I remove the duplicates that we have done, and I define the grain size of 90 meters. I'm also going to extract the outline of the state of Illinois and add all that to the map. So now I get some errors because I also have section 4, but basically I want to show you here, this is the state of Illinois, and this is the data we're going to be using. So we have 812 final points for the model. Then in a different script, I also loaded the state of Illinois border, and now this is what we have been doing before in previous models. So we bring here the Landsat 8 surface reflectance image collection, and we filter by bounds to the state of Illinois. I'm only keeping images with less than 50% cloud cover between 2018 and I'm going to do 2020, that's the data. And then we keep the months of June, well, we can try only June, but maybe we don't have enough images to cover the entire state. So I'm going to run this pretty quickly and show you if we do the NDVI here. Well, we have a complete mosaic, so we can use just the month of June to match what we have from the present date. Even though there are some cloud gaps there, so we may want, yeah, you see that those gaps there, those are clouds, so we're going to use also the month of May and make sure we have a complete mosaic. There you go, all those gaps are gone. And then so what we're doing here to this image collection that we filter, we're applying a mask. This is the function that comes with Earth Engine. And we are also selecting only the blue, red, green, near infrared, and the sweet one bands, and we are renaming them. Then we are calculating NDVI, as we have done before, using the near infrared and the red. And then we are mapping all these functions to the entire image collection. And we can see that we have 113 Landsat images to calculate this mosaic. Finally, I'm applying here a water mask, and in this case, instead of using elevation we used before, I'm using this global surface water dataset, and it's actually a pretty good one. I would recommend to look more in the details. But authors created based on Landsat, the distribution of permanent waters across the globe. So we can use that permanent waters, basically the lakes, to mask them out from our Landsat composite that we are going to use as predictor variables. So then once I have that and I'm happy with the image I have, the predictor variables I'm going to use, I can copy and move it back to our section 3 where we have the predictor variables. So this is important, just you don't need to keep using the entire code here modifying, just go to another script that is clean, work on your Landsat. When you're happy with everything, you just go back and plug it here in our main script. So we have now section 2 and section 1, 2 and section 3 complete. The next one we don't have to touch much. We're going to be doing like the data cleaning for creating that area to select for the pseudo-absences. We're using the cluster method, and also we need to create a grid, and in this case I'm using a 60 kilometer grid. So now I can run this to show you. So always good to check that the grid is actually displaying well. It's what we want, and the idea to create pseudo-absences is also making sense. So the grid looks good. Turn off that, and the area to create pseudo-absences will load in a second. We can also display NDVI or the true color for our Landsat. So this is the good thing about Wood Earth Engine, is the capacity to process this data so quickly. And this is our composite for Landsat. While this loads, I'm going to continue with the section 5. Section 5 we don't need to touch anything. We just want to run the SDM function. Then, oh, there it is. So this is looking good. So basically all the forests here are staying away from to select pseudo-absences. That's more similar conditions to our presence data in the Landsat. So next we define 5 iterations. We provide some numbers there. Again, you can run it with a random function to generate random seeds. In this case, I'm just using predefined numbers so we all get the same results. Then I'm flattening this and I'm starting to extract. So in section 6, this is not going to run. It's going to get memory limits, too many points, too much data, high resolution. So I will not try to display anything here. Also notice that I'm not dividing the screen. I'm just working with the map function, the map add layer directly. So what we want to do is extract all the habitat suitability predictions and average them. And once I have that image, that's the one I'm going to export. So this will run in batch mode. The next thing I want to do here is just to show you a little bit how I'm building this from the general model we ran before. I want to bring the accuracy assessment, all of it, up to the metrics, and I can copy them here. So I have them all, and then I'm going to be running this in batch mode, I said. So from the script, I want to export the model average. I don't want the distribution map. I'm going to explain you shortly why. I want the matrices, the accuracy matrices. So I'm going to export the model average, and I want to export the accuracy matrix. I'm not going to use the AUC ROC. I want to use the area under the curve, the precision recall, because as we explained before, we have presence only data, and this is the metric we should be using. On top, on the other metrics, I'm going to be extracting sensitivity and specificity. So now I can run this, run it on the tasks, and so we can export everything we need. I already did this and prepared a script to visualize. I export actually the final map to the assets. I put together a script just to visualize those model predictions. So here is the habitat suitability for wood thrush, across Illinois at 90-meter resolution, and this is the predicted potential distribution. Here are the CSVs that I exported with the area under the curve precision recall for each run, for each iteration. It's not great, it's not bad either. And then here are the other metrics. So we have the false negative, false positive rate, precision, true negative rate, true positive rates, and the cutoff. From the cutoff, that threshold, you can just calculate the mean here. And then in the code, I say use a function greater than equals to the mean of that threshold and obtain the potential distribution map without having to do it directly in Earth Engine. So that saves you. You can use the same habitat suitability image and then transform it more quickly into the habitat, the potential distribution. I can zoom in here and you can see how cool is predicting this on the, if I put the satellite behind, you can see that the forests are coming up pretty cool as wood thrush habitat. There is a little bit of over prediction on some probably cornfields that are really green, so the NDVI probably playing a huge role. But then we can incorporate other variables to try to improve this model. We can incorporate radar data, and radar is really good at separating woody vegetation. So for this species, it's going to be probably help improve this model. One thing I haven't talked before, but one of the main disadvantages of this is that exporting these models takes space in your Google account. So you have to be careful when exporting maps. If you look at the paper, the wood thrush for the entire eastern USA was more than 1 gigabyte. So yeah, it's going to take space in your Google Drive if you are doing that, but we recommend just cleaning it up. So download as soon as you can from your Google Drive into your machine and save it somewhere else. So then you're not taking all the space on your Google account. But I think this has the potential, like trying to do this with R definitely is going to be more complicated than what I just show you in using Google Earth Engine. So yeah, this is all I have to show you, and I hope that you will find it useful for your own data and your own studies, and looking forward to see your maps. Thank you.